Hi guys, welcome to Tori Stories. We are going to continue reading our book, Serafina and the Black Cloak. We're going to continue on chapter 3. Serafina slowly opened her eyes. She didn't know how long she'd been asleep or even where she was. She found herself crammed into a tight, dark space, her face pressed against metal. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She stayed quiet and listened. It was a man in work boots, tools jangling. Feeling a burst of happiness, she wriggled her way out of the machine and into the morning sunlight pouring through the laundry windows. "Here I am, Pa," she cried, her voice parched and weak. "I've been gnawing on leather looking for you," her Pa scolded. "You weren't in your bed this morning." She ran forward and hugged him, pressing herself into his chest. He was a large and hardened man with thick arms and rough, calloused hands. His tools hung from his leather apron, and he smelled faintly of metal, oil, and leather straps that drove the workshop's machines. In the distance, she heard the sounds of the staff arriving for the morning, the clanking pots in the kitchen, and the conversations of the workers. It was a glorious sound to her ears. The danger of the night was gone, and she had survived. Wrapped in her father's arms, she felt safe and at home. He was more accustomed to mallets and rivets and kind word. But he had always taken care of her, always loved and protected her. She couldn't hold back the tears of relief stinging her eyes. "Where have you been, Sarah?" her father asked. "He tried to get me, Pa. He tried to kill me. What are you going to do about girl?" her Pa said suspiciously. "What are you going on about, girl?" her Pa said suspiciously, holding her by her shoulders with his huge hands. He looked intently into her face. "Is this another one of your wild stories?" "No, Pa," she said, shaking her head. "I ain't in any kind of mood for stories. A man in a black cloak took a little girl, and then he came after me. I fought him, Pa. I bit him a good one. I spun round and clawed him, and I ran, and I got away, and I hid, and I crawled into your machine, Pa. That's how I got away. It saved me." "What you mean, he took a girl?" her Pa said, narrowing his eyes. "What girl?" He made her. She was right in front of me, and then she vanished before my eyes." "Come on now, Sarah," he said doubtfully. "You sound like you don't know whether you're washing the clothes or hanging them out." "I swear, Pa," she said, "just listen to me." She took a good hard swallow and started at the beginning. As the story poured out of her, she realized how brave she'd actually been, but her Pa just shook his head. "You've had a bad dream is all. Been reading too many of them ghost stories. I told you to stay away from Mr. Poe. Now look at you. You're all scuffed up like a cornered possum." Her heart sank. She was telling him the God's honest truth, and he didn't believe a word of it. She tried to keep from crying, but it was hard. She was going on 13, and he was still treating her like a child. "I wasn't dreaming, Pa," she said, wiping a sniffle from her nose. "Just calm yourself down," he grumbled. He hated when she cried. She'd known since she was little that he'd rather wrangle with a good piece of sheet metal than deal with a weepy girl. "I've got to go to work," he said gruffly as he separated from her. "The dynamo busted something bad last night. Now get on back to the workshop and get some proper sleep in ya." Hot frustration flashed through her as she clenched her fist in anger. but she could hear the seriousness in his voice and knew there was no point in arguing with him. The Edison dynamo was an iron machine with copper coils, spinning wheels, and generated a new thing called electricity. She knew from the books that she read most homes in America didn't have running water, indoor toilets, refrigeration, or even heating, but Baltimore had all of these things. It was one of the few homes in America that had electric lighting in some of the rooms. But if her pa couldn't get the dynamo working by nightfall, the Vanderbilts and their guest would be plunged into darkness. She knew he had a lot of things on his mind, and she wasn't one of them. A wave of resentment swept through. She tried to save a girl from an evil black cloak demon thing and almost got herself killed in the process, but her pa didn't care. All he cared about was his stupid machines. He never believed her about anything. To him, she was just a little girl, nothing important, nothing worth listening to, nothing anyone can count on for anything. As she walked glumly back into the workshop, she fully intended to follow her pa's instructions. But when she passed the stairway that led up to Baltimore Estate's main floor, she stopped and looked up the stairs. She knew she shouldn't do it. She shouldn't even think about doing it. But she couldn't help it. Her pa had been telling her for years that she shouldn't go upstairs, and lately she'd been trying to follow his rules at least some of the time, but today she was furious that he hadn't believed her. Serves him right if I didn't listen to him. She thought about the girl in the yellow dress. She tried to make sense of what she'd seen, the horrible black cloak, and the wide-eyed fear in the girl's face as she disappeared. Where had the girl gone? Was she dead or somehow still alive? Was there a chance that she could be saved? Snippers of conversation drifted down the stairs. There was some sort of commotion. Had they found a body? Were they all crying in despair? Were they searching for a murderer? She didn't know if she was brave or stupid, but she had to tell someone what she'd seen. She had to figure out what happened. Most of all, she had to help the girl in the yellow dress. She began to climb the stairs. Staying as small and quiet as she could, she crept up the steps one by one. A cacophony of sounds floated down to her. The echo of people talking and the rustling of clothes, dozens of different steps. It was crowded with many people. Something was definitely happening up there. We've got to keep to ourselves, you and I. Her pa's warning played in her mind as she climbed. There ain't no sense in people seeing you and asking questions. She slinked to the top of the stairway, then ducked into a clove of the main floor that looked onto a huge room full of fancy-dressed people who seemed to be gathering for some type of grand social event. Massive, ornately crafted wrought iron and glass doors led into the entrance hall with its polished marble floors and vaulted ceilings and hand-carved oak beams. Soaring limestone arches led from the central room to various wings of the mansion. The ceiling was so high, she had the urge to climb up there and peer down. She'd been here before, but she had always loved the room that she couldn't help marveling at it again, especially in the daylight. She'd never seen so many glistening, beautiful things, so many soft surfaces to sit on, and so many interesting places to hide. Spotting the upholstered chairs, she felt overwhelmed desire to run her fingernails over the plush fabric. All of the room's colors were so bright, and the surfaces were so clean and shiny. She didn't see any mud or grease or dirt anywhere. There were brightly colored vases filled with flowers, to think. Flowers actually inside the house. Sunlight flooded from the sparkling, leaded glass windows of the spiraling, 4-story high grand staircase and the glass-domed winter garden with its spraying foundation of tropical plants. She squinted her eyes against the brightness. The entrance hall teemed with dozens of beautifully attired ladies and gentlemen, along with the manservants in the black and white uniforms, helping them to prepare for the morning of horseback riding. Serafina stared at the lady who wore a riding dress made of white piped green velvet, cranberry red damask. Another woman wore a lovely mauve habit with a dark purple accent and matching hat. There were even a few children there, clothed as finely as their parents. Her eyes darted around the room as she tried to take it all in. Serafina looked at the face of a lady in a green dress, and then she looked at the face of a lady in the mauve hat. She knew her mama was long dead, or at the very least, long gone. But all her life, whenever she saw a woman, she checked to see if the woman looked like her. She studied the faces of children, too, wondering if there was a chance that any of them could be her brothers or sisters. When she was little, she used to tell herself a story that maybe she had come back home one day to the house, muddy from her hunting, and her mother had taken her downstairs and snuck into the belt-driven washing machine, and then went back upstairs and accidentally forgot about her, just spinning and spinning away down there. But when Serafina looked around, the woman and the children in the entrance hall saw blonde hair and blue eyes, their black hair and brown eyes. She had known none of them were her kin. Her pa talked about what her mama looked like, but Serafina searched for her in every face she saw. Serafina had come up with a purpose, but now that she was here, the thought of actually trying to talk to any of these fancy people would put a rock in her stomach. She swallowed and inched forward a little, and the lump in her throat was so huge that she wasn't even sure that she could get a word out. She wanted to tell them what she saw, but suddenly seemed so foolish. They were all happy and carefree, and so many larks on a sunny day. She didn't understand. The girl was obviously one of these people, so why weren't they looking for her? It was like it never happened, like she imagined the whole thing. What was she going to say to them? "Excuse me, everyone. I'm pretty sure I saw a horrible black-cloaked man make a little girl vanish into thin air. Anyone seen her?" They'd lock her up in the cuckoo bird until a gentleman in the black suit coat walked by and realized that one of the men might actually be the man in the black cloak. With the shadow-hooded face and glowing eyes, there was no doubt that the attacker had been some sort of specter, but she had sunk her teeth into him, and it tasted real blood, and needed a lantern just to see, like the other people she followed over the years, which meant he was of this world, too. She scanned the men in the crowd, keeping her breathing as steady as she could. Was it possible that he was here at this very moment? Mrs. Edith Vanderbilt, the mistress of the house, walked into the room wearing striking velvet dress and wide-brimmed hat. Serafina couldn't take her eyes off the mesmerizing movement of the hat's feathers. A refined and attractive woman, Mr. Vanderbilt had a pale complexion and a full head of dark hair, and she seemed at ease in her role as hostess as she moved through the room. "While we wait for servants to bring out our horses," she said happily to her guest, "I would like to invite everyone to join me in the tapestry gallery for a little bit of musical entertainment." A pleasant murmur passed through the crowd. Delighted by the idea of a diversion, the ladies and gentlemen streamed into the gallery, an elegant decorated room with exquisitely hand-painted ceiling, intricate musical instruments, and delicate antique wall tapestries. Serafina loved to climb down the tapestries at night and run her fingernails down the soft fabric. "I'm sure most of you already know Mr. Montgomery Throne," Miss Vanderbilt said, with a gentle sweep of her arm towards the gentleman. "He has graciously offered to play for us today." "Thank you, Mr. Vanderbilt," Mr. Throne said as he stepped forward with a smile. "This whole outing is such a wonderful idea, and I must say the most radiant hostess on this lovely morning." "You're too kind, sir," Miss Vanderbilt said with a smile. To Serafina, who had been listening to Baltimore visitors her entire life, he didn't sound like he came from the mountains of North Carolina or from New York of the Vanderbilts. He spoke with an accent of a Southern gentleman, maybe from Georgia or South Carolina. She crept forward to get a better look at him. He wore a white satin cavert around his neck and a brocade waistcoat and a pale gray gloves, all which she thought were nicely with the silvery black hair and perfectly trimmed sideburns. He picked up a finely made violin and bow from the table where he had been laying. "Since when do you play violin, Throne?" called one of the gentlemen from the New York in friendly tone. "Oh, I've been practicing here and there," Mr. Bindle said. Mr. Throne, as he lifted the instrument to his chin. "When, on the carriage ride here?" Mr. Bindle retorted, and everyone laughed. Serafina almost felt sorry for Mr. Throne. It was clear their playful banter from Mr. Bindle and Mr. Throne were companions. But it was equally clear that Mr. Bindle serious doubts about whether his friend could actually play. Serafina watched in nervous silence as Mr. Thorne prepared himself. Perhaps it was a new instrument to him, but this was the first performance. She couldn't even imagine playing such a thing herself. At long last, he set the bow gently across the string, paused for a moment to collect himself, and then began to play. Suddenly, the vaulted room of the great house filled with the loveliest music that she had ever heard, elegant and flowing like a river sound. He was wonderful, spellbound in the beauty of playing. The ladies and gentlemen, even servants, stood quietly and listened to the rapt attention as they let their hearts soak in every measure of the music he played. Serafina enjoyed the sound of his playing, but also watched the dexterous fingers. They moved fast over the strings, and they reminded her of little running mice, and she wanted to pounce on them. When Mr. Thorne was done, everyone applauded and congratulated him, especially Mr. Bindle, who laughed in the disbelief. "You never cease to amaze me, Throne. You stood like a marksman, you speak fluent Russian, and now you play the violin like Vivaldi. Vivaldi. Tell us, man, is there anything that you're not good at?" "Well, I'm certainly not as skilled at horseback rider as you are, Mr. Bindle," Mr. Thorne said as he set his violin aside, "and I must say it has always been more vexing to me." "Well, stop the presses," Mr. Ballard called. "The man has a chink in his armor after all." "There," he looked at Mr. Vanderbilt with a smile. "So when exactly are we going horseback riding?" The other guests laughed, and the two gentlemen that they quipped back and forth, and Serafina smiled. She enjoyed watching the camaraderie of these people. She envied the way they spoke onto one another and touched each other and shared their lives. It was so different from her own world of shadow and solitude. She watched a young man and woman tilt their head and smile as she reached out and put her arm in front of a young gentleman. Serafina tried imitating the gesture herself. "Are you lost?" someone said behind her. Startled, Serafina whirled around and started to hiss, but then stopped herself short. A young boy stood in front of her. A large black Doberman with sharply pointed ears sat at his side, staring intently at her. The boy wore a fine tweed riding jacket, a button vest, and a woolen jodhpurs, and knee-high leather boots. He was a little sickly looking, a little frail even, but he had a wonderful sensitive brown eyes and rather fetching tussle of wavy brown hair. He stood quietly staring at her. It took every ounce of her courage not to run. She didn't know what to do. Did he think of the vagrant of who wandered in? Or perhaps she looked like a dazed servant, maybe a chimney sweep or window washing girl. Either way, she knew she was stuck. He caught her dead right, exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. "Are you lost?" the boy asked again, but that time she heard what sounded strangely like kindness in his voice. "May I help you find your way?" He wasn't timid or shy, but he wasn't overconfident or arrogant either. It surprised her and didn't seem angry at her for being there. There was a trace of curiosity in her tone. I'm not lost," she stammered. "It's all right." he said, and stepped towards her. I still get lost sometimes, and I've lived here for 2 years. Serafina sucked in a breath. Suddenly she realized that she was speaking face to face with the young master, Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew. She'd seen him many times before, standing at his bedroom window, looking out at the mountains, or galloping his horse across the grounds, or walking alone on the footpaths of his dog, where he watched for years, but she'd never been close to him. Most of what she knew about him she'd overheard from the gossiping servants, and when it came to the young master, they sure did prattle on. He was 10 years old, and his family died in a fire, and he became an orphan. His uncle took him in. He became the son of the Vanderbilts. He was known as a loner. Some less charitable folks whispered that the young master preferred in the company of his dog and his horse to most people. She'd overhear the men in the stables saying that he'd won many blue ribbons of his equestrian events and was considered one of the most talented horseback riders around. The cooks, who prided themselves on preparing the most exquisite gourmet meals, complained that he always shared the food of his plate with his dog. I've explored pretty much every room of the first and second floors, the young master said to her, and the stables, of course, but the other parts of the house are forbidden land to me. As the boy spoke, he could tell he was trying to be polite, but his eyes kept studying her. It was nerve-wracking. After all those years of been hiding, I felt so strange someone actually looking at her. It made her stomach twist, but at the same time her skin tingled all over. She knew she must look completely ridiculous standing in front of him in the remnants of her pa's old work shirt, and he must have noticed her hands were dirty and that the smudges were all over her face. Her hair was wild and banshee, and there were no hiding in the streaked color. How could he help but stare? She reckoned he was most of the guest servants, and she could see him trying to figure out who she was. How out of place she must seem to him. But the 2 arms and legs, like everyone else, with her sharp cheekbones and her golden eyes, she knew she didn't look like a normal girl. No matter how much she ate, she couldn't put on any weight in the feral leanness of her body. She wasn't sure if she looked more like a skinny little shot or a Vanderbilt boy or like a savage little weasel, but neither of those animals belonged in the house. There was a part of her, maybe a small part, that wanted to turn a tail and run, and thought that maybe a young master might be perfect person to tell about the girl in the yellow dress. The silky-laced adults with their high Fulton airs wouldn't pay a smudge-faced girl any mind, but maybe he would. Mr. Braden, he said. I'm Serafina, she blurted out before she could help herself. You fool! Why did you give him your name? It was bad enough that she'd allow herself to be seen, but now her name to be with her face, her father was going to kill her. It's good to meet you, Serafina, he said, bowing, as if she deserved the same respect as a proper lady. This is my friend Gideon, he said, introducing her to the dog and continuing to sit in the study marvelously and steady black eyes. Hello, she managed to say, but it didn't appreciate the way the dog stared at her like it was only his master's command that he kept him from chomping on her and gleaming white teeth. Gathering her courage, she took to Brandon Vanderbilt nervously. Mr. Brandon, I came up here to tell you something I saw. Really? What'd you see? He asked, full of curiosity. There was a pretty blonde girl in a yellow dress down in the basement last night, and I saw a man in a... As the courtier of the ladies and gentlemen began to flow out of the tapestry gallery and move towards the main doors, the handsome Mr. Throne broke away and approached Sheridan, interrupting her. Are you coming, young Master Vanderbilt? He asked encouragingly in a southern accent. Our horses are ready, and I'm anxious to see your latest riding skills. Perhaps we can ride together. Sheridan's face lit up with a smile. Yes, sir, Mr. Throne, he called. I'd like that very much. As soon as Mr. Throne rejoined the others, the young master's eyes immediately turned to Serafina. Excuse me, you were telling me what you saw? At that moment, Mr. Bozeman, the estate superintendent, and her pa's boss came stomping up the stairs. He'd always been a scowling face of curmudgeon. and today was no exception. "You there, who are you?" he demanded, clutching Serafina's arm so hard that she winced. "What's your name, girl?" Just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, a sudden commotion rose up in the main hall. A disheveled, overweight, middle-aged woman, still wearing night clothes, came rushing down the grand suitcase in the third floor. She crashed into the crowded flurry of the hysterical panic. "It was Miss Brahms," Mr. Broomsmith said, turning towards the disturbance. "Has anyone seen Clara?" Miss Brahms cried frantically, reaching out and grabbing people around her. "Please help me. She's gone missing. I can't find her anywhere." Miss Vanderbilt moved forward and took the woman's hand in an attempt to calm her. "It's a very large house, Miss Brahms. I'm sure Clara is just off exploring." Worried discussion spread through the crowd, and all the ladies and gentlemen of riding party began talking to one another in confusion, wondering what was happening. "Miss Clara Brahms," Serafina thought. "That's the girl in the yellow dress." The whole time, Miss Bozeman kept her hand clamped on his arms. She wanted to leap forward and tell everyone what she had seen, but what would happen? Where would she come from? They demanded. What were you doing in the basement in the middle of the night? There'd be all sorts of questions she couldn't answer, and all of a sudden, Miss George Vanderbilt, the master of the house, walked into the center of the crowd and raised his hands. "Everyone, may I please have your attention?" he said. All of the guests and servants immediately stopped, looked, and listened. "I'm sure you all agree that we need to delay our ride and search for Miss Brahms. Once we find her, we'll resume the activities of the day." George Vanderbilt was slender, dark-haired, intelligent-looking gentleman in his 30s, with a black mustache and keen, dark, penetrating eyes. He was well known for his love of reading, and he was fit of a healthy-looking man, too, who seemed far younger than his years, and Serafina wasn't the only one who thought so. She had heard the servants in the kitchen joke about their master must have secretly discovered the fountain of youth. Mr. Vanderbilt was a meticulous dresser, and he was admired in commanding presence. She couldn't help but notice his clothes, too, in particular his shoes. Like the other gentlemen present, he wore a gentleman's riding jacket, but instead of riding boots, he wore expensive black patent leather shoes, and he strode across the hard surface of the marble floors. His shoes made a familiar clicking sound, the same sound that she had heard in the corridors of the basement the night before. She looked at the other men's shoes. Burden, Mr. Throne, and Mr. Bindle riding boots in preparation for their outing, and Mr. Vanderbilt was wearing dress shoes. He approached the lost girl's mother and consoled her. "We're going to search this place from top to bottom, Mr. Brom, and we'll keep looking until we find her, Mrs. Brom, and we'll keep looking until we find her." He turned to the ladies and gentlemen and waved out the footmen and maidservants as well. "We'll break up into 5 separate search parties," he explained. "We'll search the entire house, all 4 floors and also the basement. If anyone finds anything suspicious, report it immediately." Mr. Vanderbilt's words struck fear into Serafina's heart. They were going to search the basement. The basement! That meant the workshop. With a mighty twist of her body, she yanked herself out of Miss Bozeman's grip and darted away before he could stop her. She bounded headlong down the staircase and into the basement. She had to warn her pa. The leftovers from last night's dinner, the mattress she slept on, they had to hide it all. Thanks for joining us for Chapter 3 of Serafina and the Black Cloak. Join us again tomorrow for Chapter 4. And thank you guys for listening to Tori's Stories.